provide good feedback to a writer? Being able to provide great feedback to help a writer improve their skills will make you a more valuable marketing leader. And bonus, if you are a writer and watching this video, what I'm going to walk through today is basically the 3 types of writers that any marketing team would work with and describe how to give feedback to those kinds of writers. So you can listen in and kind of try to identify yourself as well and understand how you can teach people how to give you effective feedback. Feedback is enormously valuable. Writing is a craft, and like any craft, it is best learned in the real world by practicing and getting insights into how people react to that work when it's put in front of them. Providing feedback is a skill that you need to develop. It is something that will help you be able to lead a team of writers. It is something that will be able to evaluate other people's work more meaningfully and evaluate your own work, like I said before. So let's dive into the 3 types of writers and how you can provide meaningful feedback to them. So I'm going to start because I have quite a few writers on my team at Hire a Writer, which is my copywriting agency, and I have learned over the years that different kinds of writers need different feedback to their work. They don't just need the substance of the feedback to be different, they need it delivered in a different way. So there's a level of nuance to how you maybe provide the exact same kind of critique to 2 different kinds of writers, which is why I broke up this video on writer feedback this way, because I think that is actually the most important consideration when it comes to getting somebody to actually take what you say and apply it to their work. So the first person that we're going to talk about is the creative writer. So creative writers, let's talk a little bit about who they are. They're highly focused on the craft. They understand that writing is what they want to do with their lives. They're very sensitive to their skill development. They're ambitious, usually, about creating their own work in their own name. So these are often the kind of people who are writing a novel on the side, or who will one day do that, right? They may have an MFA in creative writing. They're usually pretty good with narrative, and they're usually pretty flexible and able to adapt to a lot of different styles. I really like creative writers. I also have found through the years that my leadership style and the way that I receive feedback, which is very direct and to the point and matter of fact, is not very effective for somebody who is a creative writer. So if you kind of look through this list and you think about what I'm identifying here, those are clues into whether or not somebody is this kind of person. And then knowing that, you can kind of be armed to apply these 3 feedback tips. So the first feedback tip for creative writers is to go deep. They don't want a surface level, hey, change this section. They want a more in-depth analysis of what they did, what worked, what didn't work, what you liked, what you didn't like. Just because they do tend to be a little bit more artistic and creative, they can be more sensitive, but don't let that hold you back from really going there and going deep into a thoughtful consideration of why you do or don't like something that they did, and then giving them real guidance on how to address that, especially when you see patterns. Because like I said at the very beginning, they are so focused on skill development. So anytime you can spot a pattern and help them course correct, that's going to be a huge benefit to them, and it's going to make them receive your feedback more openly. The second feedback tip I would have for creative writers is to be specific. Because they tend to be very detail-oriented people, anybody who's very good at writing is very detail-oriented. And they probably agonize over their own work a little bit. Okay, so out of all the 3 kinds of writers we're going to talk about today, creative writers, I would say, are closest personally to their own work. Even, that's going to sound really contradictory when I go into the second type, but they are emotionally involved. They are invested in this. It's like the work is their child. And not necessarily the work that they would do in a marketing context, but just know that that dynamic kind of exists in them as creative professionals. And so generalities tend to not work because they want to know exactly what did I do and why didn't you like it. So getting really highly targeted in the way that you provide feedback to them, even down to word choices and styling, these people tend to be very smart. They'll pick it up fast and they'll be able to adjust as needed. And then the third feedback tip I have for creative writers is to be technical. So they want to get better at this as a skill. They understand that writers are like carpenters, that this is a craft. They also can tend to be very long-winded and wordy. These are often people who have done writing in addition to maybe doing it academically and doing it professionally. They've probably done writing recreationally. And when people write recreationally, they're very fast and loose. They're very expressive. They can be very wordy. They think Faulkner is it, right? And they're trying to imitate him. They need to learn brevity and clarity. That's often the most important lesson for them to learn. So technical feedback will help them shape their writing into something that's a little bit more neat and a little more packaged. Okay. That's creative writers. They're a huge asset to you. I love hiring creative writers, but you have to be clear when you give them feedback. And if you can take those three pieces of advice, I think that that will go a long way in helping you get to the point faster and appeal to who they really are and what they want so that they improve their work, so that it meets the demands of the moment and the demands of the business. All right, so the second type of writer that I'm going to talk about providing feedback for is the independent writer. So I said a minute ago that creative writers are often closest to their work because it's like their child. Independent writers kind of are the work. So there is a kind of writer out there in the world who pretty much only ever writes in their own voice. When you meet them, you're like, oh, that's you. Like, it's very recognizable. Most of what they create is very, very stylized, very niched. They often thrive in hyper niched scenarios and industries because they're able to. They're not very adaptable. They're not chameleons. Creative writers are chameleons. Independent writers aren't really. They're a little bit more one lane, one note. And that's not a bad thing because they can bolt in and become extremely excellent at that voice and at, being themselves in a powerful way. Note about this really quick. On the blog version of this, I actually highlight 3 of my writers who I think fit these categories pretty well. So if you want to go look at that, you can actually look at their work because I linked one of their articles and see the style. And you can kind of see the vibe of what I'm explaining here, like in real life. So creative writers might not be as much of a chameleon, but they have a very distinct voice. It can be a little limiting if they don't learn how to flex. And so your job as somebody who's providing feedback to them, if you're in an editorial role, is to first be permissive. So what they won't respond to well is for you to be like, no, this is how it needs to sound. I have had to, this has been a really hard one for me, a huge learning curve because I often have something very specific in mind that I want a writer to produce for a specific client, and I am a writer, so I know how I would do it, right? And so it's really hard for me sometimes to let somebody do it their way and to not edit the things that are really just style choices. Like, well, I wouldn't have worded it that way. Well, is it wrong? Letting them be themselves is very, very important because if you don't have that baseline, you're never going to have enough trust to really get their best work out of them. They're not going to feel like it's a fit. So it's very important to be permissive. My second feedback tip for independent writers is to be collaborative. They need to feel celebrated for who they are, and they often benefit best from like a collaborative editing or a live feedback experience. So when you can explain what you mean, they can react kind of strongly. So I don't think that they're often as sensitive maybe as a creative writer, but they can react very strongly if they feel like you're coming against the voice that they've so carefully cultivated. So it's important that you kind of avoid misunderstanding in giving feedback to this kind of writer, and sometimes just getting online, getting on the phone, getting on a Zoom, being like 15 minutes, we're going to sit down, we're going to go through this. Here's kind of my impression of this piece and what I'd like you to work on. I think that can be a really helpful piece of, a way to go about providing feedback to independent writers. My third tip for providing feedback to independent writers is to be discerning. So again, this is another thing I've had to learn, especially managing a copywriting agency. Not every writer is the right fit for every client. And this often has nothing to do with their skill. They may all be equally skilled, and some of them are just better at certain things. And so it's important to be discerning because when you're providing feedback, and if you just feel like this kind of writer doesn't get it, it may not be that they're bad at it. It may just be that they're in the wrong role. They're working with the wrong client. They're in the wrong vibe. It's not the right setting for their set of skills to shine. And as an editor or a leader, it's obviously your job to bring the best out of them. So just to be discerning and think about what you're giving feedback on, and if it becomes super repetitive and it's not incorporated well, pull that back on yourself and think, okay, as the leader, do I need to reorganize some things and make sure that this person is set up to do their best work with me? The third kind of writer that I want to talk about is the marketing writer. Marketing writers are one of the best resources in the world. A marketing writer, you may think, okay, well, all of these we're talking about as marketing writers, but marketing writers are not creative writers. They don't want to be novelists. They're not going to run off and join the news team. They don't want to be journalists. Like, they understand how copy is related to marketing, and even better, related to the bigger goals of growing a business. So they are all about the utility of copywriting. You'll find, and I have a guy on my team like this, he's like my MVP. He understands the nuances of how copy needs to shift in order to meet the demand of a certain business goal. And knowing that kind of changes how he structures things, and it changes the strategies he uses and the tactics and things like that. I go into more detail on each of these on the blog, by the way, so you can kind of get a little bit more color. But a marketing writer is definitely gonna be a great ghostwriter. Okay, creative writers and marketing writers in this context are gonna both be very good ghostwriters. Independent writers, not so much, but these guys can be anybody. They're super flexible, they're super agile. They can usually write a lot of different types of copy really well because they've made themselves that. They've made themselves fluid enough to kind of get why we're doing what we're doing and how it's meant to achieve goals. So feedback tip, be descriptive. Explain why something needs to change. If you discern about somebody on your team that they have this in them, that instinct for the business, invest in it, right? Like, make the most of your opportunities to interact with them and relay what you know. And so be descriptive when you edit them. Explain to them why it needs to change, why that CTA wouldn't work, why the audience segmentation doesn't match that kind of phrasing, right? Like, they can go there with you, and so they can be really fun to work with and really fun to give feedback to because you're really using it as a training opportunity. The second feedback tip for marketing writers is be direct. So as you can already see, like, you can kind of assume as I'm describing this that there are certain kinds of personalities that kind of fit with each of these, right? And one of the keys of a marketing writer, and this is what I am, is just to be direct. Just tell them what you like, tell them what you don't like. You often don't have to really beat around the bush. You can just kind of be direct, and like, you don't have to cushion the blow. You don't have to give them a compliment sandwich. Like, just, be as forthright as you can, again, because you have an opportunity with these people to do more coaching. And so spend less time in the nitty-gritty and the nuance of the copy and get, kind of into the bigger picture, which is what they want. So giving them that opportunity is really helpful. Okay. And then the last feedback tip for this group is to be consistent. So the best gift you can give a writer who has a real aptitude for marketing is consistency. Because if they are as business-minded as they are, then they are going to have their eye on leadership roles. They are going to have their eye on chief editor, their eye on marketing director, they're probably not going to stay as just copywriters, and if they are, they want to be the highest ranking copywriter. So you need to make sure you feed that ambition, because that is a good ambition, and if they can grow into it, they can be a huge asset to you and to your company. All right, feedback to writers. It's not a no-brainer. Like, you do have to think about it. And even as you consider kind of these tips for each of these types of writers, as you can imagine, you also need to know the writer so that you can kind of customize your delivery. Some writers are very sensitive and will immediately pick up on what you imply. Other writers, you have to be extremely overt and direct, or they don't understand what you're talking about. So absolutely, it's that kind of discernment and people skills has to be paired with some of the more technical things that we've talked about here today. Subscribe to my channel and go read this blog. You can subscribe to our blog, or you can get on our list. We send out like a monthly newsletter with all kinds of writing tips and business tips and all kinds of wonderful things, and I wish you all the best.